Welcome to the Good Book Tales. Today, we're diving into one of the most powerful and misunderstood speeches in human history, the Sermon on the Mount. But before you scroll away thinking this is just another Bible story, let me ask you something. What if I told you that this ancient sermon wasn't just about peace and humility, but about revolution? Not a violent uprising, but a revolution of the human heart. One that has quietly shaken empires, toppled systems, and rewritten what it means to live with real power. Picture the scene, a dusty hillside overlooking the Sea of Galilee. The sun is low, the air is thick with the smell of salt and sand. Hundreds of people gather, fishermen, mothers, children, tax collectors, outcasts. They're tired of Roman oppression. They're tired of religious hypocrisy. And then, this young rabbi named Jesus steps forward. No crown, no army, no political slogan. Just a voice. Calm, clear, and utterly unshakable. Blessed are the poor in spirit, he begins. And the crowd falls silent. At first, it sounds poetic, even gentle. But as he keeps speaking, his words start to cut through the noise of the world they knew. Love your enemies. Turn the other cheek. The meek will inherit the earth. These weren't comforting phrases to make people behave. They were spiritual dynamite. The Sermon on the Mount was a call to reorder everything. Power, pride, justice, even love itself. It wasn't about submission, it was about awakening. For centuries, people have read these verses as moral lessons. But what if there's something more, a coded guide to inner freedom? The kind of freedom no empire, no government, no force could take away. That's what makes this sermon revolutionary. It speaks to the powerless and says, you are not forgotten. It looks at the oppressor and whispers, there's a better way. It challenges us, even now, in a world still driven by ego and conflict, to imagine a kingdom built not on control, but on compassion. But here's the twist. This revolution doesn't start out there in the streets. It starts inside you. Inside me. Inside anyone who dares to believe that gentleness can be strength, that mercy can be mightier than revenge. And yet, as we'll see, this message was dangerous. It threatened those in power, political and religious alike. Because once people start believing they are free on the inside, no chain can hold them. So what was Jesus really saying on that mountain? What made his words echo through centuries, stirring hearts and shaking thrones? And why, even today, are so many afraid to take his message literally? Stay with me, because in the next part, we'll uncover how the Sermon on the Mount became not just a teaching, but a blueprint for revolution, one that's still unfolding right now. When the crowd gathered that day, most of them didn't really know who Jesus was. Some had heard whispers, stories of healing, of water turned to wine, of a man who spoke with a kind of authority that didn't sound like the teachers they knew. Others were simply curious, hoping for a miracle or a message that could make sense of their suffering. Life under Roman rule was heavy. Taxes crushed the poor, soldiers enforced the will of the empire, and religion had become tangled with power. People were hungry, not just for bread, but for meaning. They wanted hope that felt real, not just promises that faded in the dust of another day. And so they came. Farmers left their fields, fishermen abandoned their nets, mothers carried children on their backs, and all of them climbed that hill. They sat in the grass, quiet and waiting, as the breeze carried their thoughts like prayers. What was he going to say? Would he speak about Rome? About revenge? About freedom? They wanted revolution, but what they got was something different and far more dangerous. Because the revolution Jesus spoke of wasn't about overthrowing rulers. It was about overthrowing the kingdom inside the human heart, the pride, the greed, the fear. That's what made his words so radical. Imagine hearing him say, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." To most, poverty was shameful, a sign of failure. But he turned that idea upside down. He said the ones who had nothing were actually the ones closest to heaven. To the crowd, it must have sounded strange, maybe even impossible. How could weakness be power? How could peace defeat violence? Every sentence he spoke flipped the world's logic on its head. It was as if he was quietly rewriting the rules of existence right there on that mountain. Some in the crowd nodded, others frowned. A few whispered to each other, wondering if he was serious. The air felt thick with something new, not rebellion, but awakening. Even his followers didn't fully understand. They wanted a kingdom that could be seen, with thrones and armies. But Jesus was painting a different vision, a kingdom built on forgiveness, compassion, and courage. The kind that starts invisible and grows unstoppable. And somewhere in that moment, beneath the sunlight and the murmurs of the crowd, a few began to realize that what he was offering wasn't just hope, it was a challenge. A new way to live that would cost everything. Because to follow this Sermon on the Mount wasn't to escape the world, but to confront it with love that refused to hate back. And that's when the real question began to rise, quietly and dangerously in every heart. If this message is true, what will it demand from me? As Jesus spoke, the tension in the air grew heavier. His words didn't just comfort, they confronted. The rich shifted uncomfortably. The proud looked away. Even his closest followers felt the unease of what he was saying. The conflict wasn't between armies or nations, it was between two worlds. The old world of power, pride, and domination, and this new world he was describing, where humility and mercy ruled. The Sermon on the Mount was tearing open a question no one wanted to face. What if real strength isn't about control, but surrender? Some in the crowd wanted to believe him. They had seen too much pain to trust in swords or kings. But others couldn't let go of the old ways. They wondered if this teaching would make them weak, if loving their enemies meant letting injustice win. And among them were the watchful eyes of religious leaders and Roman informants, listening closely, trying to decide whether this man was a prophet or a threat. Every word he spoke carried weight, the kind that could inspire hearts or start a fire. Meanwhile, his disciples exchanged uncertain glances. They had left everything to follow him, but now his message seemed to drift further from what they expected. Peter clenched his fists when he heard, "Do not resist an evil person." He thought of the Romans, the humiliation, the endless waiting for deliverance. Was this really the revolution they were promised? Others, like Matthew the tax collector, felt something deeper stirring, a strange sense that the world could change not through force, but forgiveness. As the wind swept through the crowd, everyone felt it, the pull between the life they knew and the life they were being called to live. And deep inside, a quiet fear echoed. If I follow this path, what will I lose? The hillside had gone silent now, the crowd leaning in, caught between awe and confusion. Every word from Jesus seemed to push them closer to a choice they weren't ready to make. He spoke of turning the other cheek, of giving more than what was taken, of loving those who curse you. To some, it felt impossible. To others, it sounded like the only way to be truly free. The tension was no longer in the crowd's whispers. It was in their hearts, where belief and fear wrestled in silence. They came looking for a Messiah who would break chains, but instead, he was asking them to break the chains within themselves. A fisherman in the front row clenched his hands, his palms rough and scarred from years of work. He thought of the tax collector who cheated him, of the soldier who mocked his family. Could he really love them? Nearby, a young woman wiped her tears, not because she was sad, but because something in those words reached a part of her she had buried long ago, the hope that life could be more than survival. Even the skeptics, standing at the edges, couldn't look away. There was something dangerously true about what they were hearing. But among the crowd, shadows were moving. A few men exchanged sharp glances, murmuring that these teachings would turn the world upside down. To forgive enemies was to invite chaos. To bless the meek was to weaken the strong. They couldn't understand how peace could ever challenge power. Yet that was exactly the revolution forming in front of them, not a battle of weapons, but of hearts. And just as Jesus lifted his eyes over the sea of faces, the air seemed to tremble with unspoken questions. Everyone could feel it. Something was about to change forever. The crowd held its breath as Jesus paused, his gaze sweeping across the hillside. For a moment, everything was still, the wind, the murmurs, even the restless movement of the people. Then he spoke again, and what he said next felt like the ground shifting beneath them. You have heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. The words struck like thunder. Love your enemies? To the people crushed by Roman rule, that sounded not just strange, but impossible. The crowd stirred, confusion turning into quiet outrage. In that instant, something invisible cracked open. The listeners were no longer united. Some whispered in admiration, others muttered that he was going too far. Among the religious leaders standing near the edge, faces hardened. They had tolerated his talk of mercy and blessing, but now he was crossing a line, one that threatened their authority. If people began to believe they could be free without fear, without obedience to the old systems, everything would change. They couldn't let that happen. A few of them began to move through the crowd, whispering warnings. Be careful what you believe. His words sound gentle, but they'll destroy the order we've built. And yet, the more they tried to quiet the people, the more restless the crowd became. Something deeper than logic was stirring, the kind of truth that doesn't need permission to grow. A Roman soldier on the hill watched too, his hand resting on his sword. He didn't understand the words, but he could sense the power in them. The tension in the air was no longer just spiritual, it was political. Every sentence carried the weight of rebellion, not against rulers, but against the fear that ruled them all. Even Jesus' closest followers began to sense the danger. They could feel eyes on them, the subtle movement of authority closing in. But he stood calm, his expression steady, as if he already knew how the story would unfold. The sun began to dip lower, painting the sky with fire, and in that fading light, the crowd felt torn between belief and survival. Somewhere in that silence, the question echoed louder than ever. Could love this bold really survive in a world built on fear? The tension had reached its breaking point. The crowd was divided, hearts caught between faith and fear. Some faces glowed with quiet conviction, while others burned with confusion and anger. The sun was sinking fast now, its light spilling like fire over the hill, and for a moment, the whole scene felt suspended between heaven and earth. Then Jesus took a slow step forward, his voice steady but filled with something fierce and tender at the same time. You are the light of the world, he said. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. It was as if those words lit a flame no one could put out. People who had come weary and hopeless suddenly stood taller. The fisherman loosened his fists. The young woman who had been crying began to smile through her tears. Something inside them shifted, not just belief, but identity. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were part of something larger, a movement of quiet power that didn't depend on weapons or wealth. That was the real revolution. It wasn't about taking thrones. It was about transforming hearts until the world itself began to change. But just as that realization spread through the crowd, another sound broke the moment. The clatter of armor and the sharp voice of a soldier shouting for silence. A group of guards had appeared at the edge of the hill. The crowd froze. Whispers rippled through them. They've come for him. Yet Jesus didn't move. He looked at them, not with fear, but with the same calm he had carried from the start. For a few long seconds, it felt like time stopped. The soldiers hesitated, caught off guard by his stillness. Then, slowly, almost impossibly, one of them lowered his weapon. The crowd gasped. No one spoke, but everyone felt it, that something unseen had just shifted. The power that ruled by fear had been met by something it couldn't understand, compassion. The soldiers' eyes met Jesus, and for a brief moment, the hillside seemed filled with light that wasn't from the sun. Then, without a word, the soldiers turned and walked away. The people stood in stunned silence. The danger had passed, but the message was clear. This revolution would not be fought by force, yet it would change everything it touched. And as Jesus turned back toward the sea, the crowd realized the real battle had only just begun, not against kingdoms, but within their own hearts. As the last rays of sunlight faded from the hillside, the crowd slowly began to move, still caught between wonder and disbelief. No one shouted or celebrated. Instead, they walked quietly, each person deep in thought, carrying something invisible yet heavy, the weight of a truth that could no longer be ignored. The Sermon on the Mount had started as a simple gathering, but it ended as something far greater. The people who came seeking answers had found a new way to see the world. The revolution had already begun, not in the streets or palaces, but in the silent turning of their hearts. The fisherman walked back toward the shore, his steps lighter, the anger he'd carried for years softening with each one. The young woman who had cried now held her child close, whispering promises of hope. Even the soldier who had lowered his weapon lingered for a moment on the hilltop, staring into the fading light, as if trying to understand what had changed inside him. None of them could explain it fully, but all of them felt it, that life would never be the same again. Jesus stood alone for a moment longer, watching the crowd disappear into the dusk. His words had been simple, but they had set something unstoppable in motion. He hadn't promised wealth or safety. He had offered something far more dangerous, freedom of the spirit. And deep down, he knew that true revolutions don't start with noise, but with quiet conviction. That was the power of the Sermon on the Mount. It didn't just challenge how people lived, it redefined what it meant to be human. As night settled over the hill, the wind carried the echoes of his words. Blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are the merciful, blessed are the pure in heart. Those words would travel far beyond Galilee, passed from one generation to another, whispered in prisons, preached in cathedrals, remembered in moments of courage and forgiveness. The blueprint for revolution had been written, not with swords, but with love that refused to die. And as the stars appeared overhead, the quiet truth of that day remained, that the most powerful change begins not when we conquer others, but when we choose compassion over control, mercy over pride, and peace over fear. The Sermon on the Mount wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new way to live.